Welcome to Howdy, Theologian, Season 2, Episode 2. We're back.
We're back. We mean business.
We mean business. Obviously, we came out of the gate swinging, tackling Christian nationalism. I asked you if you had any follow-up to that. You said, nope.
No, I mean, I think this is a follow-up, right? We kind of ended our...
Don't be like Christian nationalists, white Christian nationalists.
Right.
But do we have a responsibility?
Yeah, right. What is the, the role of our faith in the political sphere?
And that's going to be what we talk about in today's episode.
That's right.
Are you registered to vote?
Yes. Are you?
I think so.
I've checked my voter registration multiple times this election season already.
I haven't checked it since last year. Is that bad?
I think you're supposed to.
Should I do it right now?
Yeah, you should check it. Is your voter registration active? Anyone else at this point, feel free to check your
We're going to put a
registration.
voting registration link at the bottom of in the show notes so folks can
Perfect.
check.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk faith and politics, and I think it's actually a bit more complicated. If we're really thinking about what does it mean to proclaim Jesus as Lord, I think that it poses some significant questions for us as Christians in a democracy and how we're supposed to engage in elections.
And the notion of proclaiming Jesus as Lord is one of the earliest ways of declaring your belief in Christ.
Yeah.
So the statement that was like that Christians made would be Jesus is Lord. And that was kind of this, I don't know, this like call, if you will, that then other Christians would respond. And it was this like, that was the language that was used at the time. And it's still the language that we use today.
Absolutely.
Although I would argue we're a little less comfortable with like Lord language in some Christian circles.
Maybe. Yeah.
Because we don't really have a feudal system anymore.
Sure. But it doesn't discount the fact that when early Christians proclaimed Jesus as Lord, that was a political statement. So we'll get into that. And what is our role in a democracy as faithful followers of Jesus Christ?
Yes, we're in a crisis of civilization. Yes, we're in a crisis of democracy. Yes, there's some mean folks out here. Yes, we've got some demagogues. Yes, we have people telling us we don't have enough funding. But somebody's got to declare we're going to keep on keeping on.
I don't want a fake fix, a fake fix. I just want the real thing, the real thing. I don't want a fake fix.
So how many days are we away from the election?
It's like 50
Ugh,
or 49 maybe today.
49.
Yeah.
I feel like I can't escape it. I'm on Instagram. That's the only like social media place I really live. Used to be on Twitter. I can't do it anymore. I tried to do all the other things, all the Twitter alternatives. It doesn't work for me. So I really just live on Instagram now.
Yeah.
I guess I'm about to be 40. So that's a good place for me to be.
You'll see all the TikToks 2 weeks late. It's fine.
Totally. All the Reddit posts from like a month ago. I am on Reddit, but that's okay. So I'm on Instagram a lot, and it feels like I can't escape politic talk. I guess the algorithm is just dialed in, and it is just feeding me politics nonstop. What about you?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the case. Now, the actual individuals that I know and I follow aren't constantly posting about it, but they still post pictures of their kids and, the bread that they baked and, that kind of thing. But
it's getting in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's everywhere.
One of the people I follow on Instagram, Shane Claiborne. You know Shane Claiborne.
I do.
What
was his book that looked like it was duct taped with the cardboard? Something Revolution.
Irresistible Revolution.
Yeah, Irresistible Revolution.
Yeah. So when I see Shane Claiborne's post, I'm always a bit convicted by it, because I think like what he has to say about the political reality in America and how tempting it is for Christians to sort of fall into that trap, it really makes me uncomfortable, because I can see in myself, like, I don't know, this movement, this draw, this sort of moth to a flame action in my like soul to sort of put my trust in a political party to like make everything right. And he is sort of talking about Jesus for President, which is one of his books. And he recently posted this video on his Instagram page.
When it comes to politics, one of the biggest temptations is to misplace our hope and to put our hope in a person, a politician, or a political party as if they're going to save the world and make everything right again, solve all the problems. And this is where the Christian faith is really peculiar. The early Christians understood their faith as a political declaration, as saying that our hope is in Christ alone. Every time they declared Jesus is Lord, they were saying Caesar is not.
Every time the early Christians proclaimed Jesus as Lord, they were saying Caesar is not. I guess in some sort of modern day reality, you could make the argument that every time we say Jesus is Lord, it means that we are saying a political party is not. Do you think that that's like in the conversation in churches today?
No, I mean, in talking about what we talked about last week, kind of Christian nationalism, and how that's about taking America, this very narrow, specific idea of what America is, and making an idol of that.
Right.
In the same way, I would say the issue with religion and politics is when we, as faithful followers of Jesus, look at a political party and make that the idol, or a politician as the object of think of a politician as the object of worship, and like loyalty and allegiance, right, to a person who is not Jesus. And that's, I think that's the issue, right? How do you be political if the person that you have allegiance to, the person that you follow, the person that you're loyal to is Jesus? Then how do you be political?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there are these places where politics obviously demands some sort of response for us as Christians, that I think we can faithfully participate in politics. But I do feel like there is this temptation that for us to put our hope, our like that deep abiding hope, right, which we should have in Jesus Christ, and begin to sort of siphon that off and putting it in the outcomes of a politician being elected, right? And that is especially true in today's environment, where you feel like there is a clear dichotomy between two candidates, right?
Right.
And the outcome of one being elected again seems detrimental. You can begin to put your hope and like your faith in a process that tries to elect, another candidate.
But so here's the struggle I have with this. Like, because I can see it from all ways, right? I can see how from some perspective it should be like, look, our faith and our hope is in Jesus, no matter what is happening in the world around us, no matter who is in charge, no matter what the earthly, quote unquote, earthly powers are. Like, we don't have to be afraid. We know that Jesus triumphs, that Jesus is Lord, the ruler of our lives, and we should submit to that and that alone. And we shouldn't worry then about whatever is happening in the world around us. And we should not then worry about who's elected, regardless of whether or not we believe one aligns better with our faith than another. Like, because ultimately it's not a politician that gives us hope and comfort. And it's like, yes, that's true. And also, God so loved the world that God sent Jesus into the world so that it might be saved. Like, it matters who our politicians are. It matters who our elected leaders are, because they have real impact on real people's lives that we are called as Christians to care about, that we're called as Christians to respond to and influence. And it's, so the trick is, it's like, how do you be, as I can't remember where in scripture, but how do you be in the world? In John, it's in the book of John. How do you be in the world, but not of it?
Sure.
Right? I mean, what does that actually mean? And how do you believe and follow Jesus and act like, well, then it doesn't matter what happens in the world, but also actually it does matter what happens in the world, because Jesus was in the world and cared about the world and called us to care about the world.
Definitely.
So it's like, I don't know. Where is that line? What does it mean to be in the world, but not of it? And I don't know where that line is. And I think that's the struggle that we have as Christians, is figuring out where is that line in any given political kind of moment where there are different sides of a issue.
Right.
Where is that line as Christians for us to engage?
No, I think that question's a really valid one. Like, how are Christians supposed to engage in politics? And the truth is, I struggle theologically with it, but if one was to say, like, well, just show me what you do, like, I vote in every election, right? So if my life, if my actions reveal where I think that line is, like, it's not drawn in such a way that I'm prohibiting myself from voting, right? Because I think I fundamentally believe that we have a responsibility to vote in a democracy. And if we don't do that, then we are not taking our role in a society seriously. The place where I think I get really hung up on is often I think we then sort of take the responsibility that belongs to the church and then we hand it over to our governments, right? So I go into a voting booth and I think of, okay, how can we protect those on the margins of society? That's a driving sort of ethos that I take with me into the voting booth, especially as a privileged white cisgendered male, right? But the truth is, if I'm taking care for the widow, hospitality for the stranger, visiting those in prison, feeding those who are hungry, clothing those who are naked, that very real incarnational theology, if I'm taking that seriously, we can't sort of offload that onto like government policy. The church has to do a better job. And so I think that the challenge is when we go into a voting booth, we're often like saying, yes, enact all these policies on behalf of what we believe. And then the church sort of falls asleep because we're expecting someone else to do the things that we're called to do as Christians. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. And I think there are people who would argue that a collective form of shared interest, which is basically a very like rudimentary way of thinking of a government, right? A collective kind of structure where there's shared interest, right?
Yeah.
Where like everybody has
a politic, right?
And some like skin in the game, everybody has some like stake in what happens because it impacts everybody else. I mean, I do think that we all have some concepts of like what role a government should play in helping to shape and create a society. And I actually think it's really interesting, some of the like tension in the nonprofit world is how like philanthropies have begun to do what the government won't. And nonprofits have like become almost like private entities.
Sure.
In that they create and offer public services
Yep.
that in some other countries the government does
Offers.
and
Yep.
offers, because it's like it's viewed as like part of this collective interest and like benefits of the whole society. And so it's like, I do think it's really interesting to think of the church then as a nonprofit in a similar way. Like, what is it the church's role to do, and where is that sharing with the government, and where is it like we are taking things actually that a government should do and kind of claiming them as the church, or maybe saying that the church is called to do these things regardless of the government, if the government does them at all, or to augment what the government should do. So I do think that there's like a lot of tension around the role that the church should play versus the government, or alongside the government,
Sure.
or to supplement the government,
Right.
or, but ultimately I think the question is, how do we benefit the people? Like, what do people need, and how do we respond to that need? And I think that's ultimately what Jesus did. Jesus looked at people's needs, but didn't limit it to physical. He looked at their spiritual needs as well, and then said, okay, if someone needs help, give them help, right? You look at all of his, so many, not all of them, but so many of his parables, right? Obviously, like one of the most powerful ones is the Good Samaritan. But ultimately, that's a story of someone on the side of the road who needs help. And the answer is help them. Who will help them?
I think the struggle, and what we saw by highlighting Christian nationalism last week, is that faithful people can arrive at opposing conclusions about how the government should be involved or not involved in any particular thing, right?
Yes, I think about how the government should be involved, but I think what ultimately our motivation should be is how can we help people, and whether that means we are helping them via the church, or whether that means we want our government to help them. How are we motivated by seeing people as they are and responding to the needs that they have? I just think when I look at like the baseline of how we as faithful Christians should engage in politics, it should be, how are we helping those who need help? And it's, how do those of us who have privilege help those who don't? How do those of us who are help those on the outskirts, like, right? How do we, those of us who have voice and a place at the table, how do we build that table bigger and make sure that we're quiet so other people can speak? Regardless of where you want to like expect the church to kind of step up or the government to step up, we should be motivated by that same thing.
I guess.
How do we help all of the people?
Totally. I do think that there's another perspective here, though, that says for every time we think that the government is helping, they're actually doing and being engaged in politics, right? And so sort of voting is sort of an allegiance to a political system at its very like basic level. When we vote, we participate in a political system. And I think that there are those like Stanley Hauerwas who would challenge this idea that somehow we're actually helping people by casting votes. Now, there are policies for sure that may help, but it also continues, I think, and this is the convicting part, continues a lot of harm done worldwide. Stanley Hauerwas says, if there's anything to this Christian stuff, and this is actually something I read in high school, a pacifist response to 9/11, it was really unnerving for me when I was in high school. He says, if there's anything to this Christian stuff, it must surely involve the conviction that the Son of Man would rather die on the cross than for the world to be redeemed by violence. Moreover, the defeat of death through resurrection makes possible, as well as necessary, that Christians live nonviolently in a world of violence. Christian violence is not a strategy to rid the world of violence, but rather the way Christians must live in a world of violence. In short, Christians are not nonviolent because we believe our nonviolence is a strategy to rid the world of war, but rather because faithful followers of Christ in a world of war cannot imagine being anything else than nonviolent. And and while this is quotes about violence in particular and the United States' response to what happened on 9/11 and then subsequently what happened in Afghanistan and then Iraq, I think Hauerwas's argument goes deeper to like our political engagement. It's not that voting is inherently a bad thing, but that as Christians, when we vote, we're participating in a system that ultimately will not produce what Christ can produce or what God can produce, right? And that is bringing about a world that no longer has violence or no longer has suffering. And we sort of, whether we admit it or not, we're swapping out our allegiances when we participate in governments that are constantly doing a lot of harm across the world, regardless of if they're Democrats or Republicans. And this sort of just sits with me when I go into the voting booth. It doesn't stop me from voting, but I do think that there is a real challenge here to be able to reconcile what it means to proclaim Jesus as Lord and also be engaged in politics.
I agree. And when you think of the notion of proclaiming Jesus as Lord and how that is this inherently political thing that kind of rejects then the other political options, I guess, like of the day, right? Like it's either kind of Caesar or Jesus. But at the same time, Jesus also said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And so there is, I think, a role and things that we can do that's part of participating as citizens of a national entity. I mean, of a nation, I should say. A national entity. Of a
national
nation.
entity.
Yes, of a nation.
Yeah.
Citizens of a nation. So, like, there are things we can do because that's what it means to be a citizen of a nation that has a particular political framework, right? A democracy. But then that's not the only thing we're defined by. And that's not certainly the only driving baseline, kind of core identity, like part of our identity. That means that we would forget then what is God's and how are we
to participate
in what God is doing.
Yeah.
Not just what our government is doing. So I think of these statements. I mean, I think Jesus engaged, really couldn't help it because the religious leaders at the time
pulled him into it, right?
Well, I mean, they were the political leaders of
totally.
the time, right? It was all enmeshed and intertwined.
Sure.
And they were trying to walk a very fine line between being faithful and leading their community in what they thought was faithful as Jews and not trying to disrupt the Roman Empire too much. I mean, they were trying to walk this fine line of like, how do we be Roman citizens?
Right.
Or, a Roman controlled area and be faithful to what we believe God is calling us to do. And Jesus disrupted that balance that they were trying to walk because he challenged this kind of, I don't know, the religious leaders of his time were really about like controlling and like
and power
and having power and like trying to minimize, but so much of that was motivated by trying to not draw ire from Rome. And so they were like trying to kind of
keep the peace,
keep
everything organized.
Right. Which is why so many different rebellions over, before Jesus was born and like after his death, so many rebellions were about like pushing back against the Roman oppressors. And like, that was a big part of the messianic expectations that the Jewish people had was that Rome would be overthrown. So even like Jesus himself as the Messiah, like had this political role and was part of this political struggle. And then, but was constantly reframing it, constantly pushing back against people expected it to be this very limited overthrow of this of this one situation that they were in, instead of recognizing what Jesus was saying, which was kind of once and for all this sense of I am bigger than whatever the political dynamic is that
Yeah.
you live in.
I think that's a really astute point that we can really benefit from as we move into this election. There's no doubt, I think that, Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, like, it feels like life and death for a lot of people, even probably people that I won't be voting, our voting won't be in alignment, right?
Yes,
I think
both
there's
sides,
a lot of
I
people,
think, feel like
right.
there's a lot at stake.
There's a lot at stake. And it is so tempting to believe that, like, everything that we have should go into, like, making sure that the candidate we support wins. And we can put a lot of thought and anxiety and fear. I think that all exists within the next several weeks for us. But what you just said there at the end, that, like, it's not about this one moment in time. It's not. And there were awful things done the minute Jesus was born into the world, right? The Gospels tell us about the slaughtering of 2-year-olds and younger, right? So we know that, like, Jesus lived in a time where awful things happened. And Jesus was given an opportunity to have all the political power and rejected it. And I think that elevates the sort of universal the universal trajectory that Christ is on here. It's not just about this moment in time. It's about something much, much bigger that God is doing with us through the work of the Holy Spirit to bring about the reign of God. And I guess that's the good news in all of this, because as bad as we think it may be, or as good as we think it may be post-election, God is still God. Jesus is still Lord, and we are still called to be in a deeper struggle to bring about that good news to a world that's broken and needs it. And we can't trust that election outcomes are going to do it for us.
Yeah, they're not, and we should still vote, like you said.
I agree.
And we should still vote, and we should still participate, and we can give to America what is America's, which is our participation,
even though
and our taxes.
We should pay our taxes.
Vote and pay taxes.
even though I have some heartburn when I go into the voting booth, I still go and do it. And the good news is I'm an active registered voter in the state of Texas.
So how would you answer somebody who said, "Hey, pastor, I'm a Christian and I love Jesus and I want to do what Jesus wants me to do. How should I vote?" How would you tell?
I will never tell someone how to vote.
I know, but how would you respond to that then?
If someone asked me, "Hey, who should I
I'm
vote
really
for?"
wrestling because I
would
hear conflicting views of, like, what makes me the best Christian or whatever.
Yeah. I would encourage them. I would point them to some resources that I think highlight, the truth of the gospel in a way that seems practical in their real lived experience. So, I would encourage them to read people like Stanley Hauerwas and Jim Wallace and Shane Claiborne and Nadia Boltz-Weber. I mean, I would just try to give them some resources so that they can form their own theological opinion. But I would also encourage them to spend a lot of time in prayer. And if they feel uneasy or don't know, that they should continue to have conversations with folks until they find a palpable response to that question. But I don't think it's the responsibility of churches to tell people how to vote. Unfortunately, we live in a day where simply preaching the gospel seems political. It is political, but is now being identified as part of a political party's platform. And I think that is unfortunate because it makes preaching and living out the gospel that more challenging. But there is no perfect political party. And so I think when we own up to that, we're already sort of ahead of the game. We're not after perfection. We're just trying to move the ball forward a little bit, the best we can, by participating in something that ultimately we know is not the end all be all of everything. So if we put it into perspective, I think it alleviates a lot of the pressure that we feel in this voting season.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that's fair.
Well, okay, so go vote. Check and see if you're registered. I'm registered. You're registered. We'll put that registration in the link. And then next week, we're going to talk about one of your favorite topics, Elizabeth. Idolatry. Isn't that one of your favorites?
I don't know. I don't know if I would have said it's my favorite. But I think it's an important thing for us to be mindful of. I think we probably fall into idolatrous relationships maybe more than we realize.
And especially coming out of these two conversations,
Yeah.
I think, it's going to be a really good one. Make sure you like and subscribe. And if you are just a podcast listener, just know you can have the video anytime you want on our YouTube channel. So find us there, and we'll see you next week.